Hey everyone, it's Troy Weidman here with my good friend Chuck Wisner on the Stories of People Reaching Higher podcast. If you remember from our first podcast, we've changed it because stories inspire us. I have an inspirational story and a dear friend I can't wait to introduce you to, Chuck Wisner, who's a part of our cause here with Reaching Higher and is the author of a profound book. It's called The Art of Conscious Conversations, transforming how we talk, listen, and interact. And it's had a profound impact on me, Chuck. So just thank you so much for that book. So before we get into the book and before we get into your story, why don't you give the audience a little background about yourself, personally and professionally?
Okay. Well, professionally, I am on my fourth career. So I started early in life. I was trained as a classical musician. And so I played music, and that meant everything from an orchestra to a rock and roll band to
Nice.
big band stuff and teaching. And then, life unfolds and I got introduced to architecture. And this was partly because I didn't go to college right after high school because I was in music and I didn't get some great counseling. And I just didn't want to go to music school and end up being a band director somewhere. No diss on band directors, but I was already doing an enormous amount. And then a teacher introduced me to architecture, and I worked as an office boy in an architecture firm. And I fell in love with architecture, and I did that for about 5 or 6 years.
They both have that creative gene to it. There's that
Yeah,
common thread.
absolutely. That's a common thread there. And then because had great friends in the firm I was working at who were inspiring me and teaching me, I left my hometown in Pennsylvania, a small town south New York, south of the capital, Harrisburg, and moved to Boston. I moved to Boston because it was a calling. I mean, I was so inspired. And the Boston Architectural College was the only work study college architecture school accredited in the country where you could work and study and get your degree. That meant you could do your registration. And I did work study because I didn't have the money to go to a big school. And so it was work study. I worked and I studied and I busted my butt for many years. And then
How many was that?
until I was finished with my thesis, it was probably six. Yeah,
Okay.
6 years.
And how long were you in your music career before you transitioned to that? How old were you at about in that transition?
Yeah, that was about 5 or 6 years also, ironically,
Okay.
because uh, I didn't come to Boston until I was like 24. I didn't go to architecture school until I was 24. And I had
Okay.
been in music since I was like 17 or something like that.
Pretty unique pass. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I moved to Boston. I went to I did my education, and then I became, I was working in firms. So it wasn't like I was fresh out of school and I didn't know how to draw or draft, because back then everything was done by hand. We didn't have computers.
Sure. Right.
And I worked in that field, and I worked in some wonderful buildings. One of the biggest historical renovation projects was Faneuil Hall in Boston, Quincy Markets. I was one of the architects on that. And then I became a partner in a firm. And in that firm, I learned about conflict, and one of my partners had a drinking problem, and we called in some help. And the person that helped us was again an inspiration to me. How she helped us through really bad conflictual things and bad relationships. She walked us through, and I was like, how did she do that? That was like magic. And it all spoke to my innate interest in philosophy and psychology. But anyway, Linda and I got to be friends. I started playing around with her world, learning about how she did what she did. I studied mediation. I took the same course that she took called the ontology of language. And 4 years later, I left architecture and started another career. So again, it was a calling. It wasn't a rejection of architecture. It was like a calling. It's like that
Calling up.
a calling up. Yeah. Yeah. Over here. There's something for you here. Yeah. And so then I've been in that sort of leadership advising consulting world for the last 25 years or so. And then writing my book was another calling. I always had a story that I couldn't write. And I had to bust that story and burn through some help and editors that didn't work out. And I ended up realizing, I'm just going to do it myself. So I'm sorry, that's a long story, but that's sort of this path. And each one was really me stepping into an interest or me stepping into a calling. And at the time it was risky. When I left architecture and went into consulting and advising, I had one client, I had two young boys and one client that was $100 a week. So there were risks involved each step, but the calling was what I listened to.
So talk about that calling itself. And maybe talk a little bit about, because when I look at your journey of going from musician to architect, I can see the connection there. But ultimately you're going into, yes, there's study, but you're going into coaching. And that seemed to be a whole new space. Talk about that a little bit.
It is a new space, but I learned to meditate when I was 17, and then I had teachers. I had some spiritual teachers for a long time. So I had, sort of an awareness and that idea of being a good observer of yourself through meditation. I had that always running, and it was always, even though I was doing architecture, that was always a background interest to me. And I always had a teacher.
And that was a habit.
So it became a pattern that I really was attracted to. And so what happened, Linda Reed was the person that helped us through our conflict and our relationship. When Linda came on, what she did felt, it was aligned with those interests. Like, you have to be more aware. You have to be more awake. You have to pay attention. You have to be articulate with your words, or precise with your words, And so there was a natural sort of, like, I think what she taught and what she did for us tapped into my already, practices around being in the world. Yeah.
Well, when she tapped into that and you were a part of that in the architecture firm, talk to me a little bit about how that impacted you personally and even professionally in that setting, because I'm assuming that's what really grabbed your heart to change careers.
Yeah. I think in the firm, I was always one of the partners that people look to solve some problems or people issues, right? I was pretty good with people. I had enough self-awareness, enough emotional intelligence that I could sort of manage people pretty well. But in the work that Linda did, she introduced me to a deeper level of what it means to do that, and how to be more empathetic, and how to be more effective in how we communicate with each other. So personally, it was sort of an awakening where I realized, I can relate to people. I can be kind and relate to people, but there's a deeper understanding. There's a deeper way to think about that. And when I then, in those 4 years of the transition, when I studied language, I literally had to break some really horrible habits and patterns that I had. You've heard me tell a story about, I grew up with a story that I wasn't a big enough man.
Yes.
Because of my grandfather telling me that over and over again when I didn't want to skin the deer, or I didn't want to cry, or I wanted to cry. And my sisters could, but I couldn't. So that's not a new story. A lot of men experience that.
Yes,
but I was able to, in this language study, the power of language, the power of our words, I was able to bust some of those stories. Luckily, when you bust a story, you're wide open. All of a sudden, oh my gosh, I don't have to carry that burden anymore, right? Sometimes I joke that it's amazing I'm not a schizophrenic, because as much as I talk about my grandfather telling me I wasn't a big enough man he was a step grandfather on my father's side. On my mother's side, her mother, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, adored me. And I spent a lot of time with her, and she literally, I could walk on water, And so I had these conflicting stories, but luckily I was able to bust this one and hold on to this one, bust the negative one and hold on to the positive one. So that's those personal journeys, when you have to dig deep inside and go, wait a minute, I don't need to feel that way. I don't need to believe that about myself.
Yeah, that identity. And it sticks with you unless you address it. Is that
absolutely
a fair assumption? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it impacts all your relationships, doesn't it? I mean, as far as...
Absolutely. I mean, I remember I was a successful architect. I remember being in front of bank boards, where I'm doing a presentation of a renovation of a handsome old historic building. And I was talented. I was competent, But I remember being in front of those boards and inside felt like you're really, really insecure inside, or I wasn't as good as those guys, or I wasn't as rich as those guys, you know? And so when you bust that story, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have to feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Profound. Well, thank you for sharing that, Chuck. I appreciate that. Going to dive into conscious conversations now. But before doing that, why I love conscious conversations is because one of the leadership pillars that we teach in Reaching Higher is our inner voice, our self-talk, as you know, and you went through that. And then you opened up a whole new door when you said that we're actually having a conversation with ourselves as we're having a conversation with others. So what is conscious conversations?
So I think of it as we learn to converse and learn to interact with others through our words and our language from our culture and our families. And so we adopt these patterns. I like to call them patterns versus habits because it's a little, I can think of a pattern I have and be a little just less judgmental when I ask, well, where did I get that pattern? Like when I had young boys, I would lose my temper really easily. And I realized that through this work that I had a pattern of losing my temper, but it was something I picked up from my father. And so I didn't have to, I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. I got that from my dad. I didn't choose it, but I can change it. All right. And so we have these patterns of conversations that oftentimes we're just in conversation on autopilot. Sometimes I refer to sleep talking. We're running our pattern. It takes a lot less energy. It's energy conserving, and it served us many times. But it also, when things get hot, it doesn't serve us, right? And so the idea of conscious conversations in all my studies I did in linguistics and leadership, I realized that we're never taught the fundamentals about conversation. We're never taught, why do they work? Why do they not work? Why do they often fail? And what can we do about them? And so I tried to compile in the book some lessons and tools and practices that give us some new eyes and new ears to hear and see and react to conversations in new ways. Because rather than being in pattern, we can wake up. So the conscious part is waking up in conversations versus being asleep in conversations.
Yeah, really good. And this discovery, connecting back, is what started when you were in the architecture firm with your partners and some difficulties there. That's where the discovery started to happen.
That's right. I was like, lights started going off, like, oh my God, there's a different way to do this. There's a different way to think about this. There's a different way to solve this problem or get out of this conflict. Yeah. I didn't know what she was doing, but it's because it felt like magic to me. How'd she do that?
Talk about that a little bit more. What things were magical that you saw happening in that setting when you experienced it firsthand?
I think so. There were me and my partners, smart people. We were architects. We paid our dues in school. But again, we were these partners that grew a firm, and we had these ways of interacting, and we tried to work through it, but we always get stuck. We would just get stuck. And what Linda did was ask us questions individually and as a group, but individually she dove pretty far. Like, well, why are you feeling this way? Why are you judging this way? What would you like to be different? She asked us these open questions that made us go deeper. Instead of, it's easy to say, he's acting like a jerk, so what are we going to do? It was like, well, tell me more about that. Why do you think that way? Give me some examples, And so she made us look at our thinking under our opinions or our thinking under our judgments. And that was like, they're already there. I just was never taught to pay attention, in a neutral sort of observing way, And I think her demeanor, her non-judgmental way of asking us questions, her non-judgmental way of shining the mirror back on us, is what sparked the interest for me.
That's amazing. Now, in your book, you say there's 4 levels of conversations, right? That we tell ourselves. Why don't you go through those levels and just touch base on those real quick? Storytelling is one of them, right?
Yeah, storytelling is primary. And the book is organized purposefully the way it is. There's storytelling, collaboration, creative conversation and commitment conversation. I mean, you can read about any of them, but there's a relationship between them because storytelling is primary because we live in stories, as you said earlier.
Yeah,
You know,
we do.
we have stories about ourselves. We have stories about the world. There's a poet that says that Maria, drawing a blank on her last name, it says that the world isn't made of atoms; it's made of stories.
Mm.
And so that's true. That's how our world is defined by the stories. Money is a story. Law is a story. You know, spirituality, religion, they're stories that we live by that serve us or don't serve us. And so storytelling is primary because they're lovely until they don't serve us. My example of not a big enough man, that was a story I was carrying around that affected how I showed up in the world, how I interacted with people, right? And without investigating that, that story was primary in my identity. And so until we do some of our own investigation of our own work, the next conversation, which is collaboration, which is a whole set of different tools, is how do we advocate well? How do we openly inquire? How do we dance with people in that open space to create mutual learning versus defensiveness? And as we do our work and open ourselves up and bust our stories, our ego sort of settles down. We know we have an opinion, but we know it's an opinion. We don't believe it's the truth. We can enter collaborative story conversations in a much more open way. And the metaphor I like is we can enter a conversation with a strong opinion as a fist, or we can open our hand and go, I have an opinion and here's what it is. You know, and so we can be more revealing, more humble about, I have an opinion and this is why I care about that. And these are my standards for judging it this way, or this is the power of issues. I break opinions and collaborative conversations down. But that's a different set of tools. And then if you and I are a great mutual learning collaborative conversation, automatically we sort of slip into a creative conversation. What's possible? Because the creative conversation is about possibilities. And so you and I can all of a sudden have different ways of looking at something, but when we go into the collaboration, all of a sudden a new idea might bubble up that you didn't think of and I didn't think of, but it was in that open space of curiosity and willingness to think about possibilities outside of our box, outside of our perceptual box. And that conversation, that's that art of how do we allow that? How do we trust our intuition? How do we allow those voices? How do we open our mind and our heart so those conversations can happen? And then the final conversation is commitments, which is the action conversation. It's how we make promises. We make promises every day, whether it's doing the dishes or making a strategy decision for a company. We make promises to each other. And it's a really powerful conversation that we're in all the time, but we really don't know how it works. And we have patterns. We have patterns where we're addicted to yes. We say yes when we don't mean yes. We don't know how to navigate conflictual requests. So that conversation is about really making commitments and making promises that we can keep, because guess what? The more we keep our promises, the more trust we build. Yeah. And the more goodwill we build. And then we can do bigger things together because we have that trust base. So it's a really quick, that's the 4 conversations in a quick overview.
Yeah. Well, I just think about, I want to pause for a second to make sure everyone gets it. Chuck, think about what's happening in what social media influences just what I would call the banner posts and the division and take a side and even the comparison. This has never been more needed. And the education of this has never been more important, especially in this country right now.
Right.
Because we see individuals that can't have a conversation and have a different opinion, and we feel that we have to then judge. It feels like to me, very simply from a layman's terms, but then, okay, I have to judge that person and I'm going to treat them differently because our opinions are different. And you unpack this masterfully there and say, no, that's not I don't have the word for it, but you unpack what's missing in all of that. So
yeah. And you know, our stories basically are 3 things. There are emotions. We have emotional reactions to what's happening in the world. And of course, we need to work on managing our emotions and becoming emotional intelligent. There's facts, and facts are things that we can agree on, that we choose to agree on because of our culture, our society, our government. And that's taken a back seat, sort of. And then there's our opinions. And that's where we get in trouble, because our opinions, rather than holding them lightly, we hold them like a fist. And so we end up in these battles. And so to deconstruct them, to take them apart and go, wait a minute, what are my concerns? What are the power issues? What are the standards I'm judging by? What do I really want to have happen? Those are 4 basic questions that, if, put them on a sticky thing, it's like my desires, my concerns, my power issues, and my standards. Every conversation you have, if you're strongly holding an opinion, if you ask yourself those 4 questions, it's like opening your hand. Or if you're in a tough conversation with someone who is closed-fisted, ask them those questions and they become a little more open. And the other thing I want to say about this, I just wrote an op-ed piece for my local paper called When Reason Prevails. And in it, I'm talking about a successful town meeting we had and relating it to the national discourse. But in that article, I also remembered that many years ago, 25 years ago, I studied this project in Sweden called the Natural Step. And there was a bunch of scientists that couldn't agree on climate change and environmental issues. And so what the doctor that put all this together, the Natural Step, did says, well, can I get these scientists that disagree? Can I get them to find things they agree on?
Interesting.
And he got them down to 5 really profound agreements about natural resources, about not taking more from the earth than we can put back. I mean, I can't remember what they were, but literally got all these scientists to agree those 5 things. And the king of Sweden was impressed. They did a video and sent it to every citizen of Sweden because he was so supportive. And it's changed Volvo. It even changed McDonald's in Sweden. And it changed other companies like manufacturing companies, refrigerators and stuff. And so I'm saying that because sometimes we forget that we agree on more than we disagree. And we forget to ask, well, even at the beginning of the conversation, what are the things we can agree on? What are the things we can have a foundation of mutual respect? And that's a practice that is really quite rewarding if you can remember to do it and get people to do it. But if anyone's interested in more, you can just Google Natural Step and you'll see the incredible revolution of this process.
Would you say this process, even conscious conversations, it starts with awareness? It starts with, you talk a little bit about autopilot and our brains being on autopilot in the book. So expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. So awareness is key because, well, let's see. When we have a pattern and we're on autopilot, right? It's not until something happens that we go, that really doesn't feel right. I mean, the result of our pattern doesn't feel right, or the consequences crappy, right? When we can acknowledge that, so a little bit before you even get to awareness, can we accept that we have this trigger, or can we accept that we have this reaction and that it's not serving us well? As soon as we accept, then we can go, then we're opening the door to awareness. We can be curious about what is that, where did that pattern come from? Yeah, my anger pattern came from my pup. That piece of awareness is it's sort of like we live in ourselves and our world makes so much sense, and when we become a witness, we sort of step out of ourselves and we can step out and observe our pattern in a non-judgmental way. And that witnessing is the awareness piece. So rather than be in it, we have a deeper core consciousness that is that witness, that can witness our thinking. Because our thinking isn't our reality. Our thinking is just this machine that's rolling all the time to make sense of the world for us. So we step out as a witness. That's the awareness piece. And that's where the growth can happen. And we can let go of things, or we can make effort to change things and create practices to change things.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, your focus on thinking really impacted me. And I'm going to read a quote from within your book. And the quote was this: it turns out that our emotions don't drive our thinking. Rather, our thinking drives our emotions. And that's exactly what you're talking about right now, right?
Yeah. And so we often get the cart before the horse. I have an emotional reaction and then we try to dissect the emotional reaction. Like, I don't want to feel this way. this really sucks. They shouldn't have done this to me. He shouldn't have said that. She shouldn't have done that. But if we realize that, wait a minute, my emotion is and I think it was Proust who said it best, they're like emotional upheavals of our thinking, right? So there's our emotion, but if you look under, there's a thinking pattern that says, people shouldn't treat me that way, or beliefs, that are often fighting with reality, right? And so if we look at our thinking underneath, and even those 4 questions I talked about earlier, what do we want? What's our desire? What are our concerns for the future? Are there power issues? What are my standards for feeling that they're a crappy person? That is a way of going under the emotion and saying, what are my thoughts that are causing me that discomfort? Yeah.
That's what I like so much about your book, because in my mind, you empower the individual, because instead of having our focused on why is that person saying this, why is that person judging me like this, you go back to your thinking. And so emotions, correct me if I'm wrong, but should be a trigger, should be a little red flag that goes up. I need to get curious. My thinking might not be right here. What's going on inside of me that I'm feeling this? Is that accurate?
Yeah. It's sort of like a little emotional antenna. We, instead of reacting, and another way to think about it is, instead of the emotion having us, like we have an emotion and it sort of like becomes this, whether it's fear or anger or defensiveness or whatever, it sort of takes over, right? As soon as we go, whoa, look at that, I'm having a fearful reaction. We're a witness state, right? And instead of it having us, we have it. We can look at it, we can hold it and go, do I want to keep this one or not? Is this serving my life? Is this not serving my life? Is this helping my relationship? Is this not helping my relationship? But we have it instead of us overtaking us.
Yeah. Chuck, take a second and talk about how our ego plays into all of this, because it plays a role, doesn't it?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And, we all need egos. We all need to have a sense of who we are and a sense of identity and remember our name and all that jazz. But the problem with the ego is we have multiple egos, actually. We have multiple sub-personalities that we developed as we grew up. But our ego tends to, whatever story we have, good or bad, our ego tends to defend it. It wants us to be right. It wants us to, I want to be right, right? And the ego encourages us to, no, you're not wrong. You're right. Go battle. Go win. Go tell them they're full of crap. But because it's holding on because it's identity. Our ego wants to protect our identity, and our identity is often attached to our ego. So when we start to loosen the reins of not believing every thought we have or not believing every story we have, we don't have to ban the ego, but we can remind the ego that, right now I'm sort of investigating. And yeah, you know what? I can let that go. I don't need to be defensive right now. So it's that clinging, it's that defensiveness that the ego gets involved in, that when we start our journey of investigating our own thinking and our own awareness, we can tune the ego down a bit. And the result is we're still going to have opinions, but we hold them differently. We hold them lightly. We're still going to have opinions, but we're more humble. We're willing to be vulnerable. We're willing to say, I was really wrong. I was pushing and pushing, and I realized you convinced me I'm wrong. That ability to go, wow, Tori just taught me something, and damn it, he's right, and I'm wrong, and mea culpa. I'll never do that again.
Yeah. Well, let me touch on that a little bit, Chuck. So you've shared a lot personally on your own journey today, and some of the victories and that growth. But you're an executive coach as well. You're coaching executives. I know that you've been out to Michigan while you're having coaching sessions. Most of these executives are pretty hard driven. They have ego. They have all of that there. So I want you to talk to some of these future leaders that are listening to our podcast, mm-hmm, and why this is so important in leading an organization. Maybe talk about some of the breakthroughs that you've seen with some of these CEOs, some of these executives who started applying those principles into their leadership.
Yeah. There's two tracks, I'd say. One is for young leaders and senior leaders to know that we are trained as managers, leaders, or even individuals from our schooling on up to have the answer, to be the smartest one in the room. And what that is, it translates into feeling like we have to know, like we're the knower, right? And we've all experienced where we've been in meetings where we say, I know I have the right answer, or we experience other people being obnoxious, saying, no, this is how we have to do it. That's that knower tendency. When I work with leaders and I say, the higher you get on the ladder, the less you can know about everything. You know a lot of context, a lot about finances and this and that, but detail-wise, you have to rely on your expertise. So there are times that instead of being a knower, you have to be a learner. You have to be willing to say, ask the questions, get the best out of every person, appreciate their expertise. Let them have their expertise. You're their leader. Let them shine. You shine as well, because you're letting them shine. So that notion of shifting into a learning mindset is really a big shift for a lot of these folks, because they're trained up and they're rewarded for the opposite. They're rewarded for having the answers, for being the smart guy, for being the best engineer. I work with doctors, great doctors, and they get to be in charge of a 100-person department, and they don't have a clue how to lead. No, they just know how to do heart surgery, right?
Yeah.
So that's one avenue. The other avenue is the thing we touched on earlier is awareness of our patterns. And so an example I have is someone I worked with that last year, that really passionate, smart leader of a, it wasn't a startup, but it was an offshoot of a larger company. And he had a team of 10 people and he was really passionate. He was very successful, but he wasn't feeling any connection with his team. And so what I often do is I offer to come in as a neutral observer and see them in meetings. Now, obviously I'm there, so people's behaviors changes a little bit, but I was new enough that the old patterns came out. So this fellow, let's call him Norman. That's not his name. What I observed was he would have a meeting and they have an agenda and they have a time frame, and then he would get up and the first thing he would do is say, here's the problem we're trying to attack. And then he would, on the whiteboard, he says, I think that, it means this and it means this, and this is what we can do. And he was very passionate, literally so passionate, he would get red in the face. It was so exciting what we can do. And then he would say, what do you think? Crickets. Totally crickets. No one would say a word. And what he wasn't aware of was that his leadership style of being passionate, of being loud, of telling them the answer.
Yeah, right.
Right?
That's what I took out of that.
He's the boss. We're not going to disagree. No, Norman, we shouldn't do that. We should do this, because his passion might come to you. He was oblivious. And so all I got to do was say, Norman, is this how you want to show up as a leader? And then here's what you can do. Before you give them the answer, state the problem, ask them what they think. Ask them before you solve the goddamn problem.
Yeah, right.
Right. So
but that was just a pattern.
That was just a pattern, right?
And that pattern served him very well, probably to get to this, this role. But all of a sudden, he needed to change once he got to this level.
He needed to change, yeah. And he needed to see the pattern. And I could non-judgmentally say, you can it's just a pattern, Norman. You didn't choose it. This is how you became successful. But you know what? Right now, you have a choice. You want to change it or you not want to change it? Do you want to be seen as that leader or you want to be seen as a different leader? And then he gets to make the choice. All I can do is guide him. All I can do is show him or hold the mirror up or whatever I'm doing. Yeah. So I think those two big things is like adopt a learning curiosity mentality as a leader, bring other people in, get their voices in the room, make it psychologically safe. Because ultimately then in the book, the real art of collaborative conversations is allowing many perspectives to surface. Many different perspectives, and just hang in that space for a long enough time that you can go, wow, there's different perspectives here, but there's some threads that we can connect. How do we connect the dots? But it's allowing those multiple voices.
Yeah. You said a word, curious, having a curious mindset. And I know you're passionate about that. I know your belief in the power of our mindset, even personally, right? In your health. Expand on that a little bit more. How your research and how powerful is the mindset, in Chuck Wisner's opinion?
So for me, uninvestigated mindset, it might be serving us well, but when we're in a situation where like my diagnosis with leukemia and or issues with my first marriage. I'm in my second marriage for 42 years. So that was a long time ago. But the idea of checking to see, how am I framing this? What are the stories I'm telling myself? Because mindset is based on our stories. What a story am I telling myself that's keeping me stuck or keeping me full of stress? And can I investigate those? And just that act of curiosity opens our minds and our hearts. It's just asking the question, what is this serving me? Or how is this, what result am I getting? What consequence am I getting by this behavior or by this framing or by this story that I'm telling or mindset that I have? And there's some new neuroscience research that is a very big science term. It's called bigger, better offer, which basically,
I haven't heard of that yet.
Yeah. Once you say, okay, look at, here's my mindset, here's my story I'm telling, and this is how I feel when I hold that. I feel stressful, I can't sleep, whatever. Just shining the light on that and going, is there a different, how would I like to feel differently? Or if I drop that mindset, or if I change that mindset, what's the bigger result? What's the bigger, better offer? I'd be more relaxed. I'd be more present. I'd be more, awake, right?
You remove all these obstacles that are getting in the way out.
Yeah. And you say, and the change effort becomes that attraction to the better offer, the better result, the more relaxed, the more open, the more present, the more whatever. That's the attraction to say, I can take the energy to change this because I don't want this, I want that.
In those stories, back to, you said this originally with your grandfather, your step-grandfather, many of these stories were unfortunately given to us, right? That they had that. And I want to go back, you mentioned leukemia, because it had such an impact on me. And I believe at the core of especially what we equip people with is we change their mindsets. And it's so powerful. And you did not let that diagnosis stick to you in regards to their diagnosis of leukemia. So can you share with the audience what your mindset is around that?
Yeah. So originally, and I think it coincided with my studies around language and the power of words and all that jazz. So when I got diagnosed, it was pretty scary, and I got conflicting stories about, you have 5 years to live. We don't know how long you have to live.
Emotions had to be going all over the place.
Yeah, emotions. And I had 2 young kids, and I just wanted to see them graduate from high school. But one key thing I did was, I refused to say my body is riddled with leukemia, I have cancer. Instead, I said, I have a diagnosis. I don't know what that means, but I have a diagnosis, right? That's a shift from going, oh my gosh, I'm going to die in 5 years. And the whole thing just starts spinning and you start going down the funnel. And it's a self-fulfilled prophecy. When I could hold it out here and go, well, this is a diagnosis. What does that mean? Because when I held it out here, then I could look into my research. I could look into what can I do. I can look into what other people have done. I saw a healer in Brazil. I saw the Dalai Lama in India. I researched all these things. I did medical things. I found out about combinations of like natural things like green tea that I could do that had an effect on the actual cells of the leukemia. So it wasn't I didn't do anything. It was just like my ability to hold and go, okay, so what can I do about this diagnosis? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's powerful in my mind. Yeah, it's not just a blind faith is what you're saying. What makes sense to me is it allowed you to take action. It allowed you to move. It allowed you to be curious, to not just, right, and really search all of this. It's just, but sometimes it's hard for us to understand it because, medically and this and that, you'll get a lot of other opinions, right?
Yeah. And, even though I was doing alternative things, I didn't not also listen to my Western doctors. I was like, there was a curiosity. I want it all. Give me it all. I want all the information I can get because that was 35 years ago.
35 years ago.
And, there's probably some luck. There's some things that I'm doing that, like I really, really try to live not a very stressful life because stress is a killer is a cancer breeder. And I do some other things holistically, but there's probably a bit of luck too, where, my body responded to this particular kind of leukemia in a different way than another body did. So I don't know, but I'm blessed to be here.
We're blessed to have you, Chuck. We're blessed to have you. So let me ask you, why are you part of the work of Reaching Higher? Why did you say yes to coming alongside and being a part of us?
Yeah, well, so my connection was with David because we worked together 35 years ago or so when he was at Chrysler, right? And so David reached out to me and he remembered the work we were doing. We were doing some very, I guess I'll call it deep transformational work with leaders in about 8 or 9 companies around the country, including Chrysler and Shell and others companies. So deep leadership transformational work over a course of 6 months or so. And it was really sweet that he still lived with that experience of what we were doing. And so he and I had a conversation and he explained to me what Reaching Higher was. And so for me, there was a natural synergy of what I've been teaching and what my experiences have been around reaching higher and waking up and be willing to take a risk because I'm listening to my intuition or whatever. And so there's a natural synergy there. And quite honestly, there's not enough work being done in the world from a raising consciousness, raising awareness point of view. There's plenty of studies on how to make a meeting better, how to listen, how to do this, but to really, really help people sort of take a deeper dive into themselves, not to be reflecting and what's it called, gazing our navels, but to really from a curious learning perspective, how can I be a better person? How can I do more? How can I engage the world in a better way? What's calling me? All those things. It's amazing actually how much more mindfulness is available, is easy to talk about now than it was even 10 years ago.
How can we really, really lead others until we're willing to lead ourselves? Until we are able to look at inner leadership. And as you've shared over the time, unfortunately, the world and everything else, it doesn't stop. In other words, that's not a check mark typically of going into a leadership position or even developing. It's just all of a sudden, you're a great performer. We're going to put you into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's all of a sudden, so we're dealing with it reactively instead of proactively. And that's what I like to say, Reaching Higher is really addressing this and planting this seed proactively.
Yeah. And the work you're doing with young kids in schools is that planting that seed.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so grateful that you're a part of us. So Chuck, how can listeners get your book? It's out there on Amazon,
Barnes & Noble, or ask your favorite bookstore to order it. They probably don't have it, but ask them to order it. There you go.
There it is. Yeah.
And in fact, 2 days ago, last week, I got my third translation. It's an Arabic translation of my book. I don't have it here. Otherwise I'd show you because I can't read a lick of it. But it's fun to look at the calligraphy. It's just mind boggling. Anyway, yeah, it's on Amazon. Get it ask for your bookstore. On my website, chuckwisner.com, there's a place you can get a free PDF of the introduction just by putting your email in. And okay. I don't spam anybody with email. I mean, I barely even pay attention to it, but that's a good way to get a free introduction.
Awesome. Chuck, well, it's been such a pleasure to unpack this, and I'm just grateful for our friendship now and for you being a part of Reaching Higher. And thank you for impacting lives.
Thanks.
And the organizations that they're a part of. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you.